Welcome to Lecture 1 for the course Pentateuch. This lecture will cover the introduction to the Pentateuch. Let's begin by looking at the introductory paragraph in your course notebook. Here it says that the Old Testament canon, which is a term meaning measuring rod or ruler, is divided into three sections. The Torah, which is the law, the Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which are the writings. Now, the Torah is commonly called the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This lesson will discuss what the Pentateuch is and defend who wrote it. Let's begin by looking at Roman numeral 1. What is the Pentateuch? Letter A. The Pentateuch consists of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Those are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And letter B, from these writings, the Hebrew people find their history and rule of life. Thirdly, Jesus taught that the Pentateuch was everlasting. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, he said, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, which is a jot, not a dot, which is a tittle, will pass from the law until all is accomplished." A jot is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. That would be the Hebrew letter Yod. And a tittle is a distinguishing projection between 2 Hebrew letters. On your screen, it would be the difference between the Hebrew letter Bet and the Hebrew letter Kaf. Not much of a difference, extremely minor, but that is the point Jesus was trying to make. Also, the use of law in Matthew 5:18 most likely refers to the entire Old Testament, since the Jews commonly referred to the entire Old Testament as the law. And in addition to Matthew 5:18, Jesus declared in John 10:35 that the scripture cannot be broken. And letter D, Paul taught that the Old Testament Pentateuch was inspired by God. 2 Timothy 3:16 says, "All scripture is breathed out or inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness." The writings themselves were God-breathed, and the writer was motivated to pen them according to 2 Peter 1, verse 21. Therefore, the Pentateuch should be seen as inspired literature by God Himself that, according to Jesus, is everlasting. Roman numeral 2. Who wrote the Pentateuch? Now that we know what the Pentateuch is, let's discuss who wrote it. However, before we get into a definitive explanation of the writer, let's look at some of the various views concerning who wrote the Pentateuch. The first view is known as the fragmentary theory. The fragmentary theory believes that the Pentateuch was composed during the Solomonic era, or during the days of Solomon, from many separate fragments, some of which were as old as Moses, or even older, and then were just fitted together into a storable text. The second theory is known as the documentary hypothesis. This is also commonly called the Wellhausen hypothesis, or sometimes the Graff-Wellhausen hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis believes that the Pentateuch was a compilation of portions from various documents composed at different places and times over a period of 5 centuries, long after Moses. This hypothesis began with a man named Jean Astruc, or Jean Astruc, and was further developed by Julius Wellhausen. Later, this developed into the Graff-Wellhausen theory after Karl Heinrich Graff taught about the Wellhausen theme and included many of his own teachings. There are 4 supposed documents of the documentary hypothesis. One thing we must remember, though, is that this hypothesis rests upon the supposed differences in the names of God and information discussed throughout the Pentateuch. The first source is known as the J, or Yahwist source. The J stands for Yahwist because there is no J sound in Hebrew. Instead, it's like the English Y. That's why we call it the Yahwist source. Now, this view believes that this source was written about 850 BC by an unknown writer in the southern kingdom of Judah. It further teaches that the difference in this document rests solely in the frequent use of Yahweh instead of the other names of God. The second source is known as the E, or Elohist source. This view believes that this source was written around 750 BC by an unknown writer in the northern kingdom of Israel. It also believes that it is different from the rest because of its frequent use of Elohim instead of the other names of God. The third source is known as the D, or Deuteronomist source. This view purports that this source was composed, possibly under the direction of the high priest Hilkiah, as an official program for the Party of Reform sponsored by King Josiah in the revival of 621 BC. They also believe that this source is different from the others because of its unique, practical content. And the fourth and final source is known as the P, or priestly source. This view believes that these documents were composed in various stages, all the way from Ezekiel with his holy code around 570 BC to Ezra, under whose guidance the latest priestly sections were added to the Torah. They believe it is different from the rest of the sources because of its unique sacrificial content. Now, some would add a fifth source known as the R source. The R would represent a redactor, someone who compiled all the sources as one, but that source is not necessary for our study. Now that we've looked at what the 4 sources of the documentary hypothesis are, let's also examine their weaknesses. Letter A. The first thing we have to look at is the fact that this view assumes a lower literary standard for Hebrew authors than contemporary authors. In other words, these are individuals looking down on the intelligence of the individuals who wrote, or who we believe wrote, the Pentateuch just because they couldn't believe they would be that intelligent during that time. The second weakness is that these views assume a purely human origin for Israel's religion. It almost completely factors out the inspiration of Scripture. And letter C, it espouses literary duplication or repetition as demonstrating diverse authorship. In other words, this view believes that if something is repeated in a portion of Scripture, then it must not be from the same author. It had to be 2 different people. And lastly, this view assumes a superior knowledge of ancient history over the original authors who lived 2,000 plus years closer to the events that they recorded. We must understand that the true explanation for the usage of these names of God is to be found in the context from which they occur, not as a conclusion that they were different writers. And that is what leads us to letter C, a defense for the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Let's first start by looking at textual evidence for the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. First, the Pentateuch itself testifies to Moses as having composed these 5 books. It says so in Exodus 17, 24, 34, Numbers 33, Deuteronomy 31, all throughout the Pentateuch. Moses testifies that he is the one writing the Pentateuch. Secondly, the Old Testament references the Pentateuch as an already established document written by Moses. We can see this by Joshua in Joshua 1, the writer of Kings in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, Ezra in Ezra 6, Nehemiah in Nehemiah 13, Daniel in Daniel 9, and finally Malachi in Malachi chapter 4. Thirdly, Jesus attributed the Pentateuch to Moses. In Matthew 19 and John 5 and 7, Jesus clearly says that Moses was the writer of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And fourthly and lastly, the New Testament strongly affirms Mosaic authorship. We can see this when Luke in Acts chapter 3 ascribes the Pentateuch to Moses, and Paul does the same in Romans chapter 10. Now, not only are there textual evidences for the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, secondly, let's look at some internal evidence for the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Letter A. Eyewitness details appear in the account of the Exodus. 2 examples of this are Exodus 15 and Numbers 11. In Exodus chapter 15, the writer recalls the exact number of springs and wells and the number of palm trees in the area of Elim. He declares that there were 12 wells and 7 palm trees. Also, in Numbers chapter 11, verses 7 through 8, the writer gives both the appearance and how the manna from heaven tasted. This would suggest an actual participant in both of those events, and this would obviously be something that was beyond the scope of an author who lived centuries after the event. In addition to the eyewitness details in the Exodus, letter B, the author shows a thorough acquaintance with Egypt. The author was both familiar with the Egyptian names and recorded them as an Egyptian would and not an uneducated Hebrew, as one would expect of one who lived there and participated in the Exodus. Some even conclude that this shows that the individual must have been connected in some way to the royal family. Also, letter C. The author shows a consistently foreign or extra-Palestinian viewpoint so far as the land of Canaan is concerned. The author records the seasons in Canaan from an Egyptian perspective and not a Hebrew. And in fact, nothing is stated as if the author already knew what Canaan was like, as the documentary hypothesis suggests. In fact, this would show that the individual writing this knew about Canaan, but he himself never entered into Canaan. Now, we would logically conclude that that would be none other than the person Moses. Letter D. There are references to archaic customs which are demonstrable for the 2nd millennium BC, but which did not continue during the 1st millennium. Some examples of this can be seen first with the custom of begetting legitimate children by handmaidens, such as with Abraham and Hagar. Secondly, the validity of an oral deathbed will, like with Isaac to Jacob. And thirdly and lastly, the importance of the possession of the family teraphim for claiming inheritance rights, which would give point to Rachel's theft of Laban's teraphim in Genesis 31. Now, all these customs were recorded in the Bible, but secular documents were not discovered that support these customs until later in the 15th century. Fifthly, there are significant archaisms in language. The spelling of many Hebrew words in the Pentateuch are in line with the spellings of the people during that time and not later in history. An example of this can be found by looking at the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. On your screen, if you notice, it says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts." This is a very difficult passage to even read in the English today because there have been so many changes in the English language. Now those F sounds are S's, so it's not "thus saith the Lord," it's "thus saith the Lord." This is a great example of how we can look at the Pentateuch and the archaic language used in it to show that it was not written after Moses, but it had to have been written during the time of Moses and the Exodus. And lastly, there is a most remarkable unity of arrangement that links it all together into a progressive whole. Even though successive stages in Revelation result in a certain amount of overlap and restatement, we can confidently conclude that repetitions, duplications in passages do not mean different authors wrote them, but that perhaps the writer was trying to make emphasis. With all of these textual and internal evidences from the Pentateuch itself, we can confidently conclude that the Pentateuch was written by Moses. That brings us to the end of Lecture 1, the Introduction to the Pentateuch.